You bring me up. Check, 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 check. Are we live? Good morning, everyone. So, this is our Thursday 10 a.m. slot. Not the most ideal slot for a screening, so we decided to put the conversation here. Um, Obviously, we haven't had a chance to watch any of these projects yet. So this conversation is very much a conversation and less a Q&A, right, about the works themselves. And maybe we can articulate some ideas that might help ground our experience throughout the festival week in this conversation. That's what we like to try to do. I like to imagine that I am a large format camera and that I have a slot somewhere right around here, kind of 3/4 of the way back in my head, and that you can change the slide, the big piece of film that's in that slot. And I like to think of that big piece of film as an idea. And I can hold an idea there, not in the front of my mind, because if it were in the front of my mind, I couldn't see what I was doing, right? I couldn't experience the world as it's coming to me. But if it's there in the back of my mind, it can help govern or influence my response to the world, if that makes sense. So maybe this can be like the little large format, piece of film that we just slide right back into the back of our heads, so that when we watch the projects that all the projects that you made, all the projects that other folks have made, we can hold some of these ideas there and see if it influences our experience at all and changes the way that we respond. If that makes sense to everybody. So that's what we're kind of doing here. And I'm going to probably say some relatively provocative things that relatively, that I might not really believe. So just fair warning. Yeah. Well, like a job interview. Well, I might be an agent, but hopefully not an institutional one. But I'm gonna ask you guys to. I know it's on the spot, right? And we haven't really told you what the subject matter of this conversation is, other than that you've brought something to Boulder, you've brought something to Mimesis to share with everyone, and so I'm expecting that you'll filter your responses through what you've brought, right? To the ideas that I'm going to kind of spit out now. So it's on the spot, but we're going to try our best. The title of this conversation is not my title. The programming team came up with this. Is seasonal longing. And the keywords are metaphorical landscape, historical memory, and cultural mythologies. And I'm really hung up on landscape. Like the rest of them, I think all can come into the conversation through landscape. But before we get to landscape, even still, the conversation last night, I think, was very relevant to what I was thinking about when we were planning and organizing Mimesis 2024. And so I kind of want to connect us first to last night's conversation into this morning. And that is the idea of the avant-garde, which I think is a strange idea. If you notice that there's this little blurb of text, I think, in Mimesis 2024 branding on the website and in a few other places about poor images and fallen avant-gardes. And I feel like the avant-garde is dead, in the sense that we maybe once knew it. But I do think that there is a future in which the avant-garde, so when I say the avant-garde is dead, I don't only mean that literally. In that, yes, many of the people are dead, right? who were probably uh, cornerstones of what we think of as the avant-garde, as a kind of 20th century socio-political arts movement, right? And we're now in the 21st century, and maybe some of those impulses are still present. They're still among us, right? It passes between us. Quite sure how to bring them into the world in this like contemporary control society. And I genuinely believe that documentary is probably the best way back in to the avant-garde. That's what I'm going to propose to you all. And I don't mean documentary as reportage, not the journalistic documentary, but that documentary that is sharing experience. And then that might be the way to get back to maybe what the French realist painters were doing in the 19th century, which was they were trying to show the world as it was, not how it might be. And that was a radical act, right? It was dirty. The paintings had filth in them. There were people picking with sticks at the ground, peasant laborers. Like it had this very obvious documentary impulse. And I think the avant-garde has moved away from that in the 20th century a bit to become something interested in expression, interested in abstraction. It became very poetic, but maybe poetic in a less documentary way. And I think now we can bring it back. We might be able to bring it back to maybe what I think was its initial impulse, which I find to be a documentary impulse. Anyway, that's my first provocative statement. The avant-garde is dead. It was supposed to die because that's what the front line does. It dies first, right? It is the advance guard. If it survived, it probably wouldn't be the avant-garde, right? So it kind of has to die. But now, what's the next advance guard? And I'm hoping that can be that's what we can do as documentarians, or as documentary artists, as I like to phrase it. That's why we call everyone an artist here rather than a filmmaker or a producer. Anyway, hold that thought, and we'll come into seasonal longing and this idea of landscape. And I want to get there through the idea of the image. And I don't mean an image in the sense that we now, I think, assume, which is always a visual sense. I think that image has become a very visual thing, that the idea of an image. And I'm not sure that images have to be. And by that, I mean, an image can be a mental image. You can read poetry, you can hear poetry, and still form images in your mind. And I don't know if anyone's familiar with Victor Shklovsky, who wrote Artist Technique. Yes? Anyone? Artist Technique? Yes. And Artist Technique, I've been trying to teach this to my undergraduates in intro. And it doesn't work as well as I hope it does, because I'm trying to decouple the image from visuality in some way and use the idea of an image to mean something else. And in fact, the image always meant something else, because it comes from the Latin, which is I can't actually remember what the Latin say it, imago, indeed imago, which means ghost, among other things. Memory, ghost, it comes from the same root as mimesis, to imitate. Indeed. And Shklovsky, right, an image is not a permanent referent for those mutable complexities of life which are revealed through it. Its purpose is not to make us perceive meaning, but to create a special perception of the object. It creates a vision of the object instead of serving as a means for knowing it. And it's a complicated idea, but I do think it makes more sense to think of an image that way. An image is not the thing. It isn't. It's something else. It is itself an object. right? It is real. It's very real. That's the other part of this. It's like images are material. They are real. We can feel them. They can hurt, right? They can do damage. They can heal. They can help. They're real, but they're not the thing, right? They're a very impermanent referent. And Shklovsky uses this idea to get to his concept of defamiliarization, which is a foundational principle of the avant-garde, to make something strange so that we are forced to reckon with it in a new way. We have no choice but to reckon with it in a different way because it is estranged from our common experience. And I think that documentary has a particular power to do that. And so if we're thinking about images and we're thinking about landscapes, which is a painter's term, like it comes from painting. Interestingly enough, the way that we use it now, like landscaping our yard, right? Or, we use it very metaphorically, right? The contemporary media landscape, right, might be a phrase that we see written around. So landscape is all tied up in image, which is ghostly, which is not necessarily visual, but which is artistic at the same time. And the root of it is to shape land, right? That's what landscape means, to shape land, to cut, to manage, to control in some way. The idea of land. So what is land? And I did a deep dive on etymology of this because I'm thinking to myself, well, if we're going to talk about this, we got to know what it is we're talking about and not just use the common sense definition of landscape, because common sense definitions, turns out, aren't that common. We all have something else in our minds probably when we hear the word landscape. Some of us might have worked in landscaping in the past and might be thinking of landscaping that way. Like, oh yeah, I remember when I dug that trench and when I dumped that mulch, right? Or when I learned to turn my camera from portrait orientation to landscape orientation. And that could be what we mean when we say landscape. We could be talking about photography. We could be talking about painting, right? We could be talking about the landscape, as I said before, very metaphorically. It could be a socio-political metaphor. So land, it turns out, has this amazing double meaning that I really love, because it means an opening onto space, but it also means an enclosure, closing space down. So when we are landscaping, we are opening enclosures. We are closing openings and we're opening enclosures and shaping them in some way. And I think each project that you all have made does this in some way. It opens something and closes something in, ring fences an idea, right? So that it can be held in one film, in one project, in one artistic project. So there's always an opening where some light gets let in, but there's also this closing down that happens. And I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves as we go down the line. Maybe tell us the title of your project, which would be great. Your top level log line. But what I really want to hear is, what does your work that you're offering to Mimesis this year open, and what does it enclose? And I actually think we could start with Kelly.
Hello, my name's Kelly Sears. My film is called The Lost Season. It's about Earth's final winter. And Eric, there's so much I wanted to respond to in this. And I think I'm going to start with the term opening, because this kind of newer constellation of work I've been doing is very much a psychogeographic process where I move through various landscapes, environments, and architecture in a way where, as I'm moving through them and taking thousands of photographs to animate, it's really a time to reflect on the constructions of power, of access, of who gets to move through there, why you get to move through there, what are the conditions of moving through a landscape. And I think about these films I've been making as having one foot in speculative fiction and one foot in nonfiction. But I'm taking images of the world that we all recognize from today. And in that, I'm very interested in having it play in two ways. One, we can recognize them all as a world that we know. But I'd like to destabilize that image and open up the meaning in that image to put in a different world, a more fantastic world through which we get to critique the world that we're in right now. And so I think for me, I was so much resonating with the idea of like destabilizing as a term of critique, and still thinking about that with like, that's how like Debord would have us move through a space or move through a landscape. So that's what it opens up. The second part of the question is, what does it close down? I'm actually not sure, because I think what I'm hoping it does is it opens up and does not necessarily resolve in something that's fixed or closed. I hope with this piece and these kind of this constellation of work that I've been taking of moving through these spaces, it opens up other potentials for us to kind of think about how we can implicate ourselves moving through those spaces, and thinking about everything from our like environmental footprint, our capitalist footprint, where those two footprints like walk together, and have it be a way of just reckoning with this like moment of multiple collapses and multiple collisions.
Yeah, what the aspect of your project that I think really what do I want to say? It's like the simile. I want to map the idea of preservation and speculation to the idea of enclosing and opening. Right. So in your project, there's this double impulse that's at play, where we're trying to preserve a season, right?
Seasonal longings. Yes.
Because of this speculative future, right? And those things seem to be more in tension with each other than I think the common sense idea of preservation suggests, right? Like preservation is very reactionary in some ways. It's a reactionary impulse. And yet we preserve for this progressive vision of the future. And so in the same way that land might enclose and open at the same time, I feel like preservation and speculation are analogs for that.
And I think it also brings up this question of failure and like what are we trying to hold on to, and why, you know, in the case of this film, right, it is this like the season that's disappearing, and there's so many other ways. Like I was so influenced by, and I'm so influenced by the Donna Haraway book, Staying with the Trouble, right? And she puts forward, like, as we are all moving into this future together, you know, she rejects this idea it's too late. She also rejects this idea that technology is going to save us in some way. And yet the way forward is for us to work together and collaborate and to imagine new futures, find new forms to collaborate with, even if it's the bacteria in the compost pile, right? It's not the, I give up and let's move to this gesture. And something in this film was inspired by seeing, I think I watched the beginning of a SpaceX documentary, and just the beginning, because I heard this thing in the first 2 minutes where we need to make a plan B, which is going to Mars. And it's like, there are so many plans before we get going to Mars to think about what's happening here. That is not the next stage. There are so many, you know, global, communal, social actions we could take right now, instead of just having a few people go to Mars as our plan B. And so in the idea of kind of these ideas of how do we save something that are so imbued with failure, and saving for who, it's not a generalized for everyone. So I think that might be a way where it's critiquing this idea of preservation as an action that's like happened, that there's so many other actions that could have happened before this.
Yeah, and that ties in really beautifully with our moving creatures programming, because I am so impressed with the fact that the city of Boulder has a nature-based climate solutions department. Like, that's kind of amazing to me, that they're not looking for the next tech to solve climate problems. They're looking to collaborate with non-human entities in solving this problem, which is something that you don't necessarily expect a local government to do.
I didn't know about that, and so I'm really curious to learn more about it. The next film in this constellation actually has a non-human narrator in it, because I was thinking, I'm asking these questions and I'm asking them just from a human perspective, and that's really short-sighted at this moment in time.
And I mean, talk about an opening and an enclosing. The open between the human and the non-human is a space that is, I think, very rich for exploration, especially with documentary, which is something that I think Alexander and Hannah are doing in Strata. So maybe we can move on to Strata. Would you like to begin?
Your prompts and provocations were amazing, and I started taking notes, which I think is troubling. But my mind is sort of exploding with avenues to go down in terms of this discussion. But I'll start with what our project actually is and is about. So the simplest way I've found to describe this project is actually just to say how it came about briefly. So Hannah and I are documentarians, and I come from kind of a more, I guess, interactive and technologically driven kind of side of things, and Hannah's more of a kind of conventional documentary filmmaker in some sense. And so we have a collaboration where there's a range of disciplines at play. And so we started a residency in the Badlands of South Dakota, which is a very striking and special landscape. If any of you haven't been there, I recommend it. It's sort of the edge of the Great Plains, in a literal sense. And so we went there, and we had it was sort of place first. We arrived there knowing that we wanted to make a documentary project, not yet knowing exactly what it should be. And that was kind of philosophically grounded. We kind of have an approach where we intend to go somewhere and allow the place and the people we speak to sort of surface topics and themes to us, rather than kind of presupposing too much before we go. So we go there and we have this method, and we are, is there like a little buzzing sound? Okay, should I just speak? We're almost like a 1-to-1 ratio here. Should I just speak normally?
No one.
Oh, remotely. Okay. So, so we where was I? Oh, okay. So we're going on all these walks with all these ecological specialists of different kinds, people who work in the Park Service. We were hosted by the National Park Service, wildlife biologists, paleontologists, ecologists of different kinds, also people who just have cultural or personal relationships to this place, ethnobotanists, etc. And we had this very distinct experience where, as you walk with each one of these people, your large format camera or your sort of like sensory experience gets kind of overridden by their view of the world. They're so compelling in the way that they talk about their specific discipline that you get totally involved in it, and you leave. And if you were speaking with a birder, it's like your whole world is suddenly birds. If you're speaking with a paleontologist, this landscape is incredible because you look down and you see 27 to 32 million year old death just littered all over the ground. And so you're suddenly in this deep past. And so you're getting kind of overridden by all of these deep specialties. And it was felt almost impossible to do the thing that is often a documentary gesture, which is to somehow take a bunch of complex, specific ideas and views and somehow summarize or create some kind of map where you say, all right, well, I'm going to take the liberty of just mapping all these things out for you and sort of presenting it, synthesizing in some way. Obviously, not all documentaries do that, but so it sort of seemed extraordinarily impossible in the context of this place. And so what we chose to do is, to realizing the kind of impossibility of that, we came up with kind of an experiment, which was, what if we took all of these different people and constrained the domain that they were actually spending time in? What if we brought them to a very small space, a space that is maybe 4 times or so the size of this theater, and had each of them just walk through this one piece of land and just describe it from their vantage point, from their specialty, from their personal experience. And we did these walking interviews where we recorded their location, where they physically were in this space, and made a detailed 3D scan of the location. And then we've created this performance where we now are building a live film for you that uses this location and these people's stories as a point of departure. So I will be moving through this landscape. You don't see anyone, you just hear their voices and they're spatialized. And then Hannah kind of edits in response to that back and forth. And in a simple way of understanding it, I think, is like I have kind of made this sort of serendipity engine where I have all these people moving around, and I bump into these different vantage points, these different points of view, and then Hannah uses that as a point of departure. So that's just the basic description of what we're doing. The maybe responding thematically, the one thing I might mention is I think, speaking of images, I think one of the most confusing types of images is the map, because it gives you this undeserving sense of an overview or a grand perspective, which, you know, the history of landscape painting, which is deeply related to the national parks and is related to this term, where it's sort of like subjugating nature, making nature a thing that is down below that can be viewed and can be sort of consumed by a person. So this is sort of our project in some simple way, I think, is a kind of anti-map, where we're trying to make something where the technologies I'm using are all have their origins in mapping and surveillance and military technology and all this stuff, and have this incredible power to give you these summaries almost immediately. And we're sort of saying, okay, what if you don't get that? And what you get instead is the capacity to see things at 6 inches away and like this ultra close experience. So that's long story medium with kind of what our project is. Anna?
I don't quite, sorry, I think I'm thinking things through, and so I don't know what I'm going to say. It's interesting. It's just interesting for me hearing some of the things that are being surfaced, like the artist technique or staying with the trouble, both of which I've been spending time with. I've been thinking a lot about the very oft cited phrase of making a stone stony as the purpose of art. And I've also been thinking a lot about speculative practices in terms of ecological practices. And I guess, I think the way that I would like to respond right now is just to surface some of the ideas that I'm grappling with, because I think in some ways that's why I came here, was to grapple with some of these ideas. And one thing that I've been particularly interested in some of these speculative practices, and I don't know how I define speculative, by the way, I think that's a really big question, but is about the idea that speculative practices can ultimately actually bring you back to the present. That there's something about playing with temporality, especially in documentary, and its seemingly privileged relationship to the real or to the indexical, that allows for a represencing of what's now, that then allows for different possibilities in the future. And I don't totally understand that world yet, but I think that's a very powerful thing. And so I've been thinking, I guess this isn't a question about landscape. I think that, Kelly, I think I'm sort of building off of what I heard you talking about. I think I'm thinking a lot about, process. Process is a really important, like how you make a film. I think that, yeah, at least for me, like I take quite a long time in my projects. So I'm mostly making films, like, you know, they're coming out sometimes, but mostly I'm making things. And so I think a lot about, that's actually my life. The making things is my life. So that better be meaningful. That better be the practice. And so I've actually been thinking about speculative practices as a way of, what it means for process. And I've been finding, and this is something that I'm still trying to find words for, but I've been finding that there are certain ways of experimenting with form, whether that means, let's say, not doing a linear structure in a film, or making things into a 3-channel installation or a performance. Like it could be in terms of how it's presented, but also could be structurally, that there are ways of really changing the way that we engage in the world in the making of. And I think speculative practices, at least for me, and maybe just to step back and give some content to what I'm saying, our last film was a speculative documentary. It's called Truth or Consequences, and it like very subtly was set in the near future. And it's in the near future when commercial space travel has started to happen. And it spends time with people who ostensibly didn't leave, which would be all of us probably. And so, but my experience of making that film was that speculative practices allowed actually for getting much more related to the material and much more related to the people in the film. And I'm quite fascinated by that. Formal experimentation as a way of getting actually back to the present. And I think that's why I find the artist technique a really interesting article. I think that's why I find some of these ecological speculation really interesting, because it's often saying, actually, look at what's happening now. So I think that's some of what we're trying to do in Strata, which is part of a much larger body of work where we've been spending a lot of time in public lands, but is the idea of what kind of formal experimentations do you have to do in order to actually allow you to be in your life and present and related to the thing in front of you and listening, and potentially counter some of the very enticing and deep roots of extractiveness that documentary, I think, you know, can arise in all of us. No matter how good we are, it can still arise feelings of wanting something from somebody else or of wanting to turn something into a sexy story. And so what kind of formal practices make it possible to be engaging in a different way? So I don't know what that has to do with landscape, but that is what occurred to me through what people have been saying so far.
Everything. I mean, I think I really love the idea of infusing the present with the future through a speculative practice, rather than, I think, when you think of documentary, you think of observation, which of course is tied very closely to the idea of preservation, which is a backward kind of looking idea or concept, right? To observe and to preserve. I mean, observe, like it comes from ritual practice. You observe a rite, something that's done over and over again because it was done over and over again before. So observation contains this like kind of historical idea, like just baked into the word, baked into the idea, baked into the way that it operates. A speculation, instead of infusing the present with the past, might have the ability to infuse the present with the future, which I think is extremely exciting. Maybe a project that very literally deals with enclosure. I think you know, Curtis, that I'm coming to you next.
Nope, it was already turned on. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you. This is great. I think opening and closing is a really interesting way into my film, yeah, because it deals so directly with ideas of enclosure specifically. So yeah, my name's Curtis Miller, and I'm showing a short film that I made called A Fence is a Fence, but the Clouds Move Freely. That was a film that I sort of made accidentally while working on another long-term project that's a sort of social history of the tornado in the epicenter of Tornado Alley. So I've been filming a lot in Oklahoma and Kansas, spending a lot of time in small towns that have been affected by the storms over the years. And that project is really looking at like how the town sort of self-mythologizes its experience of the storm, or how the storm gets remembered or baked into the identity of the of where that storm took place. But in the process of working on that, I was spending a lot of time in an area of northwestern Oklahoma called the Cherokee Outlet, or the Cherokee Strip, which if people aren't familiar with like the land runs of Oklahoma, there was a big one in the Cherokee Strip, which was an area that was partitioned off originally and given to the Cherokee tribe when they were forcibly removed from the southeast and resettled in Oklahoma. And then through a series of coercive acts, that land was taken from the Cherokee and designated for white settlement through a land rush, which was this kind of spectacular event where people lined up on the edge of the train and they all ran in when a trumpet sounded, and wherever you staked your claim became your plot of land. And that whole event is heavily mythologized within Oklahoma. It's not as common now, but it used to be a thing that like high schoolers would reenact. And it becomes very much a way that Oklahoma imagines itself. A lot of films that take place in Oklahoma, especially Westerns, either directly or indirectly talk about the land runs. And so the areas that I was filming in is 4 towns specifically that are either in Kansas, just over the border from the land, the Cherokee Strip, or within the Cherokee Strip itself. So they're Wichita, Oklahoma, which those who like disaster films, the 1996 movie Twister has a lot of scenes in Wichita. And then Protection, Kansas, Freedom, Oklahoma, and Greensburg, Kansas. So one of the things, these are towns that I was thinking about preservation, what you were saying there too. These are towns that I've been driving through a lot. And one of the things that I kind of told myself that I was going to do while working on this project, because it was very open, like the feature that I've been working on is very, the process of making it was very open-ended. Like I had 3 weeks every summer that I would go during like peak storm season, and I knew that I wanted to film. And I would have a few pre-scheduled things, but it was mostly just about remaining curious and like stumbling into things. And so I told myself that I like had to stay off the interstate and I was going to drive through all these places. And so I was driving through these towns and I kept seeing these water towers that announce themselves sort of as like, you know, flags or signs letting you know where you are. And they have these pronouncements like freedom and protection. And I'm just like, well, this is peculiar. Like, why are these towns named this? And so I would try to spend time sort of exploring those towns and reading all the signage and then talking to locals and learning, you know, that was something that I tried to inhabit, is just like, you know, reading the roadside sign, like always stopping to read it. But the thing I found curious is that, you know, they present themselves as like objective forms of the past, but they always have a point of view and there's always limitations to what they're being told. And so I think a lot of the film too is about looking at the periphery of those signs and like trying to know like the conflicting stories that these towns tell themselves, you know, like Protection, for example. A lot of people who live there think that the name of the town comes from this makeshift fort called Fort Protection that supposedly fought off the Comanche for the local drinking water. But I spoke with a local historian, Dave Webb, who's also one of the only writers for their local newspaper, Protection Press. And he told me that is like, that's like completely a fabrication. Like there probably never was a fort. And the mythologized encounter between the frontiersmen and the Plains tribes is like is a fiction, but it's the story that everyone sort of tells themselves. And then a lot of people think that the name comes from the fact that it's sort of in a little bit of like a holler, or like a depression in the landscape, and so they're protected from tornadoes. But the real reason is that it was basically like a tax haven. And so a lot of it was along the Chisholm Trail, which is where they moved a lot of cattle. And there was a lot of business that could be performed in Protection that was protected from a lot of transactional taxes of the time and stuff. So yeah, for me, the film is very much about like the enclosure of that region and the ways that it's been legally handed over from various parties over the years. That's kind of where the name came from too, because I'm really interested in the way that the weather sort of resists or intersects that. It's like that each of these sites also has some sort of brief mentioning of a tornado or some sort of tornadic event. And for me, the weather is a kind of resistance to the barbed wire, because the clouds don't give a shit about barbed wire. You know, they just keep moving. So something there for me. The other thing I was reading at the time was Frederick Jackson Turner's speech that he gave at the World's Exposition in Chicago, which is where I'm from. And I was rereading that for the first time in several years. And I don't know if people are familiar with the frontier thesis that he posited, but it was the idea that the American identity is sort of sourced from this notion of the frontier. And he's writing this at a time when the US Census has officially deemed the frontier closed. Like there is no frontier that's left, at least. And so his whole thing is like, well, what happens next to American identity if we don't have a frontier? What is our fiction that motivates us as a nation? And I like this idea that the frontier wasn't a place, but was like a way of reading the land, and how kind of terrifying that is too, because it often it obscures the presence of people who were already there and that sort of thing. And so for me, it was very much like, I think I was trying to understand like frontier logic in a way. So there's like kind of play of the open range, the open frontier, and then its enclosure that I've been thinking about. So,
I can't help but think of the horizon that we all have, right, as a kind of landscaping in the phenomenological sense, like a kind of embodied landscaping that is grounded in like a very, very real, but potentially, in this case, potentially insidious subjectivity, right? In that we all have this frontier, this horizon that's generated actually from our bodies as the central locus. And as we walk toward it, like we can count the steps, but we never actually get closer, right? Because the horizon is actually constituted by what lies beyond it, which is not countable. So it's like this kind of finiteness, infiniteness that you're constantly in tension with. And when you turn that into a political agenda, right? Like this frontiers political agenda, it can be a very insidious subjectivity. And I think that we're in a moment now where subjectivity has a very positive connotation, right? Like socially. But projects like yours, I think, can complicate that. And perhaps that's maybe like in the intellectual sense, what it opens up. And, I was going to actually go to Pauline next, but now I can't help but go to Patrick. Sorry. Just because of this, we're talking about landscaping, and we kind of moved from land to the shaping of it, right? To the cutting, to the controlling component of landscape, to how it moves our bodies through space, how it moves us through the world in a financial sense. And yeah, Patrick, your project, I think, grapples with some of these issues in a complex way that deals directly, obviously, with capitalism and control societies. That could be interesting to lead on from here. So I'm wondering what your project might open and then close.
So I'm Patrick Tarrant. I'm an Australian academic filmmaker who lives in London. The film is called Privately Owned Public Space. I don't know if you hear the expression in this country. Do you hear that expression, privately owned public space? I imagine it's an expression that varies with place.
We have private space, that's for sure.
Yeah, private space, yeah. Same thing. So I encountered this expression in London. And so King's Cross Central Development is where the new Google campus is nearly complete. It's where Meta, their European headquarters, are, DeepMind, all these high-tech corporations are situated in this King's Cross Central Development, which is 60 acres, was public land, was a coal drops yard so that coal could be delivered to London via the canal system. Then trains came along and that sort of changed that a bit. So this environment is, it's a lovely Victorian canal, lovely Victorian buildings, given for free to corporate developers, which is like an extraordinary amount of wealth to give to developers. And apart from making the environment nice, all they have to do is build a little bit of affordable housing, which they always kind of renege on that and do famous things like make the poor people go in the poor door at the back rather than in the front, even though they're sharing the same sort of building. So you could dismissively describe this as a shopping mall if you want, with corporate offices and stuff. But it's very attractive. It's a space that I ran through, saw giant cranes, and imagined that my experience of running through this environment, which is a bit like being inside like a game or something, a depopulated game, because the environment is often depopulated. It's not quite finished, but it's a strange environment. They have put an enormous amount of effort into exploiting it, like making it useful and attractive. So it's a private estate. There are security guards everywhere. You can point your camera at things, but you cannot point your camera at the front of a building for some reason. So I point mine at DeepMind, and then for sure someone comes out and says, you can't do that. But on the whole, you can get away with a camera on a tripod, and they'll ask you what you're doing. And as long as you remain relaxed and tell them you're taking pictures or something, they kind of let you do that. I've been interested in images for some time now. The idea that one might find oneself making images of images. So I did that with my hometown, which had, like, say, an image problem, a poor reputation. And so I understood myself to be kind of creating images of images in that case. This development is an image, and it's full of images within it. And they are images, we call it EDI, you guys call it DIE, I think. One of the things that I don't quite understand why people are so invested in making these environments appear public. But, you know, it makes it seem like if you give away land to corporate developers, for example, you haven't lost that land or something. So maybe it's a way of softening the blow. But the idea is that you draw people into the environment, very often just to spend money. There's an enormous Samsung kind of display place there. But just taking as an example, the estate's commissioning of artists to produce work which broadly might understand to be doing DIE work. That kind of stuff is everywhere in this environment. And so I've been interested in images and propaganda and managerial nonsense and rhetoric for some time now. So when I point this camera at that environment, I want it to look nice because it does look nice. And so I want people to be forced to engage with how attractive the environment is in many ways. Because you need to be able to sort of see that in order to sort of see, let's say, the damage that is caused by giving away that kind of money. I'll just give you an example of an image that exists there. There's a vending machine. I'd never seen anything quite like it before, but then I haven't seen that much in my life. It was full of beauty products, and the brand, I don't know if you know it, I'd never heard of it, is called American Cream. And so you look at this vending machine, and you can buy various products, you know, for your face or whatever. And then there's a monitor here, and it shows people applying these creams to various parts of their bodies. One of these women, there's a white woman, then she'll disappear, and then an Asian woman will come on, sort of putting cream on her face, and then finally a black man. And it just sort of cycles through these three images. And so, I mean, the estate is much better at creating, I mean, that's not art, but it does commission art, which seems to address important kind of things that we might like to see. But I'm focusing on this particular example because I think the whole exercise is deeply cynical. But I like the kind of the problem that it poses to the observer, whereby it seems to say, there's good things happening here. It's nice to be here. We are community-minded ultimately. And of course, you can trust that Meta and Google will give some money sometimes to worthy projects and worthy artists. So fundamentally, it comes down to this sort of like this idea of being forced to sort of see the image that is presented to you in order that you might sort of see beyond it.
Yeah, it really it does remind me of ways of seeing the the John Berger piece, especially the part 4, where it kind of reveals where all of this analysis of European painting is finally headed, right? Which is into this. It's not that it just controls our bodies in the way that it's landscaped, right, or environmentally designed, or however you want to put it, but that the images actually control the way we think about it as well. And it's hard to escape from that without the distance that kind of maybe that a camera can give us. The Husserl, Merleau-Ponty, they talk about the phenomenological reduction, like this ability to not disengage, but step back just enough that we can critique, that we can figure out what's going on. And it is challenging to do, but I think it's easier when you're holding a camera. Somehow that device gives us this phenomenological reduction almost innately, like it becomes much more natural to approach the world in that way. And I think it's a very powerful thing, and I think your film does that. Pauline, I want to ask you about meatballs and how many you can eat.
It's a great question. Not that many, not as many as Jordan can. Thank you for having me on this panel. It's really fascinating to hear everybody's thoughts and practice and approach to film. A lot of things are percolating for me, from the provocations that you brought up in the beginning to everybody's thoughts on your work. I'm also thinking at the moment about mythologized weather. In a current project that I'm working on, I am interested also in the periphery, the Western, and I can speak a little bit more as to why, which is related to the work that I'm showing in this festival here. The speculative practices as they're infused within processes, that really spoke a lot to me. And of course, staying with the trouble. So I'm Pauline Shongov, and my film that is showing at my Mises is A Couple More Shovels for a Few More Levs. And I've been very interested in the Balkan region for quite some time now, as a landscape that is constantly in transition, in social, economic, political transition. And my film takes an archaeological dig in Eastern Bulgaria, in this post-industrial, archaeologically underfunded site of the city of Sliven. And it's an observational documentary that is exploring first the action of digging on a physical level, but then how it moves from matter into the psyche, into memories, into other forms of digging within kind of the personal woos of the people who are the laborers at this site. And it's speaking a lot for me, to a diasporic intimacy through which I come to that site. But also it's asking a question of who is left behind by globalization after the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc. And so I've been very interested in the Balkan region as a so-called periphery to Western Europe, a space caught between the East and the West historically. And I filmed this piece at a time when the currency was transitioning from the Bulgarian lev to the euro, which I believe now they're parallel. So you can use both lev and euro at the moment. Of course, that was many years of trying to transition away from one currency to another. And that was supposed to be the final year. So this was shot about a year or two ago. And it kept kind of being pushed back. But I'm curious about kind of the Balkan imaginary as well. And and more so, I think, to your earlier point about the avant-garde, but also the documentary impulse. And I'm thinking about how the documentary impulse can exist outside of film, where film becomes a point of departure for something larger within a process. And so I think about my filmmaking process as part of a larger research practice through kind of a research practice I've been co-leading with friends, artists, and curators, and taking kind of these fragments, visual, oral, matter, and sending them as prompt materials for artists to respond to. And so some of the people that I meet as I shoot, or some of the footage that I shoot, end up kind of expanding into other mediums and other forms as well. So I think a lot about the documentary impulse being kind of opening up of methodologies as well, and other practices that go beyond just cinema as we know it, or single channel work as we know it. So I think I'll stop there for now, but I'd be happy to continue the conversation with all of you.
Yeah, there's something very interesting about the almost very metaphorical, like financial landscaping that is revealed in the conversations that laborers have as they are literally digging into the ground with shovels to carve it up and also find something old, right? So like there is this real connection between observation and preservation, I think, in this particular piece. And then there's the very real shaping of the land. It's dirt, with tools and the labor of the human body. But then in doing that, it's revealed that there is this like superstructural effect happening, where this currency transition is reflective of this longer political transition that itself is a kind of social landscaping.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think mythology starts to play a key role in this, in the sense that a lot of the people that are laborers at the site, they're not getting paid much, if anything at all sometimes. And they're primarily there because they believe they're going to find something. There's a real itch to find gold, to find the treasure. And a lot of them kind of freelance as gold diggers on their own time. And archaeology becomes kind of a way for them to get closer to the thing that they are most interested in. But it also becomes a way and a mode of a kind of survival in a post-industrial landscape where they're always taking up an odd number of jobs, hustling to make ends meet on a number of days. And so I love this idea also of mythologizing the landscape in a way that it's holding space for people in different ways. And I think we can think about preservation practice, particularly in the post-socialist space, through kind of what a lot of academics have been starting to do within anthropology, for example, is thinking about the afterlife of socialist modernity that is always materially present but active. And it's not something meant to be preserved in kind of, I guess, the more Western knowledge scape of preservation, but it's meant to kind of decay as well. And how do we think about curated decay, which is a term that Caitlin DeSilve termed, and what does it mean to kind of, I guess, to stay with the trouble in a certain way, to allow for plant life, animal life, and for that to take over sites, to take over ways of knowing and knowing differently, perhaps.
Yeah, the weeds, at least we call them weeds, of post-industrial landscapes, I think have a lot to teach us about how to survive. There's about as many people in this audience as there are on the stage. So, and I'm sure that folks out there have ideas that they might want to share, potentially. And if we could run a mic, that would be great. And we'll keep this conversation going up till 11:30 maximum, just for everyone's information.
Well, you folks opened about 10,000 different doors, and I'm very, very grateful to you. That's what provocation is all about, and I am sure the police are paying you very well, as are the Russians, the Chinese. Let me just begin with one thing quickly. I can unpack it. There's landscape, there is seascape, and there is oceanscape. And you folks have discussed one of the three. This planet is mostly ocean. The difference between the land and the ocean is if you are in the open ocean, you can see that the world is round. On the sea, you cannot. On the land, you cannot. That's an enormous 5 million-year-old gift that Odysseus celebrated and turned into mythology. So our mythology, by that not merely talking about Western mythology, encompasses all three. That is to say, the vision of ourselves as inhabiting something round, as inhabiting salt water that is flat and not round, and land, which is flat. And of course, we come from seawater, don't we?
Some would have us believe that, yes.
Which one of us does not come from salt water? If we're human, okay. That's where we start. Second thought. There is a big difference, I think, between conservation and preservation. There's also a tremendous lot of overlap. I will beg to differ with you just to get you irritated. I don't think conservation is reactionary. I think it's conservative. And it's not the same thing. There's a big overlap, but it's not the same thing. And as soon as we get there, we get into the politicization of myth, which takes us to avant-garde and the main body and the rear guard. And I ask you two questions. Is it possible that the avant-garde has become the rear guard, or that it has joined the main body? I am leaning more in the direction that it has joined the main body. There really is, in my opinion, no high culture anymore. There is one culture. There is one body. The people on the right, the people on the left, the people on the front, the people on the back have been absorbed into one mass quite successfully. And that leads us very, very nicely to short-term profit, doesn't it, sir? Very, very last thought, hopefully, is that the hummingbird over there is an intriguing symbol, as are the flowers. And what we are missing, of course, is the smell, the taste, the touch, the kinesthetic feeling. And that kind of abstraction is the essence of mimesis, isn't it?
Responses.
I have a sort of brief anecdote that I found interesting. So, and some of you might know this already, but this I found quite intriguing. As we were sort of backfilling our understanding about the national parks, it's very interesting because it's a space where these usually slippery concepts have to actually be legislated and well defined. And so concepts like wilderness and preservation, conservation, et cetera, have to be legally defined. And there's this very interesting practice that I didn't quite understand, where there's a thing that's a federally designated wilderness area, which is a very specific kind of area, and it basically mandates that you can't do certain things. You can't drive a car into it. You can only walk in on foot or horseback, etc. And more interestingly, when you're a person who's trying to care for and manage one of these spaces, there's this weird question, which is you have to intervene, you have to do things, because the surrounding world is ever changing and ever encroaching. So if you're trying to make a choice, how do you make that choice? And so so what there is there's this definition of a sort of a time point, a point in time, a sort of set time that is defined for many national parks and wilderness areas, where there's a point in time where you're sort of asking yourself, if I'm going to intervene, does my intervention basically take me closer to the way that this space was at that particular time, or does it take me further away? So it's this weird, it's a sort of LARP, it's this sort of strange historical collaboration between a bunch of different people to sort of take a place ostensibly back to a particular time point. And tragically, kind of appropriately, in this place, that time is the 1880s. So it's the sort of time when the kind of project, this kind of frontier project, really finally washed over this place and impacted it in this new way. So I just thought of that specifically in terms of the work of preservation. It has this conservative impulse, which is literally to sort of bring something back, which will never come back in the way it ever was. That's actually not a critique. Actually, it could be a critique, but I don't feel like I have my arms around this well enough to consider that just simply a critique of practices of preservation. But I just sort of wanted to share that as an anecdote, because I think that kind of connects this, and it also connects a little bit the conversation we had about kind of finding or putting history into the land.
Yes, I'm not irritated in the slightest. Mostly because I think the job is to go too far, so that you can be adjusted just to the right point. But yeah, I just wanted to talk about the logic you just said. I just wanted to say, now apply it to immigration, and it becomes deeply disturbing, right? Like the point in time logic becomes deeply disturbing. And I am suspicious of using those kinds of logical techniques, let's put them, to govern the way that we address any part of the world, even the natural one, or the so-called natural one.
Wanted to say a little bit about your metaphors. It seems to me that there's another kind of scape, which is under the ocean, and wherein you do not see the curvature of the earth. And everyone's familiar with that old joke about sort of two fish passing each other, and one says to the other, the water's lovely today, and the other one says, what's water? And so this kind of idea of sort of the medium that you exist in, I think that metaphor is like a little bit useful for thinking about my film, because you don't know when you pass into private space, because you're still occupying it as though it's public space. And so, and I think this sort of connects to your other point about the avant-garde, about sort of being in the main body, in engaging with King's Cross Central development, although aiming to produce a kind of a critical kind of gaze. I always wanted to sort of do that from the inside of that, so like in the water, as it were.
So I'd just like to join the conversation. Thank you for the provocations and the speculations, and play tag team with my dad about two of the ideas that he's followed through on. I think the first one that I want to talk about is preservation. And I guess behind what Joseph said, to say, I don't think any act is inherently anything. So I'm not keen on labeling it anything. I think we could say what are conservative practices or reactionary practices in relationship to the project. This is in my ear, it's annoying me, of preservation or anything. This I want to connect to Hannah's point about process. It's like, well, it's sort of how you're doing it writ large, and then what you do with it. And so, like in my own thinking about the preservatory practice of documenting and holding on to documents, I'm very keen. So I sort of talk about putting things in putting things in a cul-de-sac. Like I'm not interested in putting things on a cul-de-sac of the internet, for instance, where no one ever goes. I'm interested in what it means to make something live again now. So I'm very curious and committed to now processes, and things that are conserved and preserved are extremely useful for the now. And so again, in relationship to some of the work I do on AIDS, I have a book with Ted Kerr called We Are Having This Conversation Now. We're very interested in looking at things that have been made over the brief history of AIDS, images, and mobilizing them for what we need in the present. And they're very useful. Objects are just very useful, archaeologically and otherwise, to live in the present differently in deep conversation with what people have done before you and want you to see. So I don't think it's anything until you do it. And you do it with the will and the needs that you have. I think in relationship to the provocation of the avant-garde, again, and I'm not sure I completely agree with you, Dad. I mean, what do we mean by that? People who are leading can often do it. I mean, I'm not even sure I want to use the word lead. I think that there are radical practices and practices that anticipate are living a future now that we hope might be what comes next, not spatially on the edge, but often, right here. So I guess I wonder if when you use the word avant-garde, you're referring to a particular historical practice or a way of being and a way of imagining and a way of sort of making, community and things. And I think there's always that places that are not yet congealed by capital, although they're harder to find, but I think we find them and live them all the time. And I think your work says we also find and live them in the natural world or the non-human world. I love the idea about weeds. And so, are the weeds avant-garde? Yes. Not in the precise historical political sense you suggested, but in a way that's useful to us because they live how we want to be now. And so this connects, I think, to a lot to your work. You're thinking about speculation and what you said today, which is are we anticipating a future or are we living that future now and knowing what that feels like as an avant-gardist process?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. I agree with so much about what is the intention behind a gesture of holding on, taking an image, holding on to an image, but most importantly, where does that image go and how does it get lived? And I think I really enjoyed everything you said last night at the artist talk about these are kind of spaces to think about now, but they're spaces of community coming together and that radically exist outside of capital. Hannah, your conversation about process is what I've been really thinking about so much in this conversation. And it's about a way of how do we even make sense of this contemporary that we're moving through. And I think as lens-based artists, that's so much about making. And I think really it is about my practice of making has the same footprint as my process of like interrogating the world and learning about the world and having and being shaped by the world and finding new paths through the world and new communities through the world is a tension between what communities, what alliances, what processes, what practices do I make now for me to move into a future? And always having these moments to think about what are the ethos and the politics of any of those things. And, Hannah brought up this idea of like having to maybe self check on extractivist tendencies. And it's just like thinking about when I show up in a place, how do I hold a camera? What is a mode of collaboration? What is a way of kind of maybe taking me as a maker, destabilizing that hierarchy of that and just thinking about what as we move into the future, what are these larger networks that we need to think about that we're building right now to move into that future? I also want to think about different forms of language. Can we move away from military language of the avant-garde? Can we think about what are other communities, practices? And Alex, I really like the idea of like, I want to not use the word lead. And I want to think about these areas that haven't congealed yet and maybe don't have language yet. And not that we have to name anything, but just thinking about how do we self-identify as makers? What terms do we use in our communities? And how do those become ways of thinking about future movements?
Yes, I do think that you can make work that is generative, that isn't necessarily work that is leading, right? I don't think those two things are synonymous. They are mutually exclusive.
And I'm going to, one more kind of capitalist thing right now is like, as artists, I think we all apply for grants. And there's something that we see in the language of grants, which is like, what impact, you know, which is like a step, well, what return on investment is this having? And I think some of the most powerful work I see isn't about like positing a solution, but it's about staying in the question. And I like, again, you coming back, you're like, oh, I have a lot of questions that are coming up. And I think questions are such a generative place because sometimes an answer is really fixed, but questions can go out and kind of spark others and radicalize others.
Yeah, impact is so often tied to language that assumes a product, but couldn't the process itself have impact? Like, couldn't making documentaries with communities have impact on those communities, regardless if you ever finished editing them, right? As to Hannah's point again, like always making, maybe never finishing. Are we having no impact? I doubt it. Yeah, I doubt it. Other thoughts from the audience?
Just a small thought expanding on the avant-garde, there is sort of inherently in that phrase this obsession with like novelty, newness, and so much of what we're talking about is really, you were saying, humbling yourself, this process of learning and sharing. It's like, where do we place our values, right, in the process or the product? And that's something just very interesting to me as we're, you know, if you've been submitting to festivals, you know, like every festival in the past year has been talking about historical numbers of submissions, right? And it's like, what is the value of what we do? And this is where it comes back to the process of so much of our time is spent like in the making, in the learning and the sharing, and this is the wonderful thing about being an artist, right? It's an excuse to talk to various people, right? And to be part of that process of learning and sharing. And this to me seems to be the joy and value in being an artist is not the thing in itself, but that process of engaging with the world and others around us and being part of these wonderful conversations with one another.
Yeah, I don't think we necessarily even need to have an SD card in the camera, right? I mean, you can, if you go to the restaurant and you ask for a reservation, it's booked. You go to the restaurant with a camera on your shoulder, they're going to invite you back to the kitchen and give you a free meal, probably. You know, it's a different way of engaging with the world, and I think it has that impact regardless of this product impact driven language of grant proposals and all of that. Of course, we probably do want to hope that it's in focus and we press the record button, but sometimes that's kind of an annoyance. Any final thoughts on this, Hannah?
I have, again, I think something very ill-formed that I just wonder about a lot. And I think it's like, I just wonder a lot about what makes a difference and like what makes change. And I think we're speaking about that. Like some of what I heard is, I feel very changed by my projects. I think that the people I work with also feel changed. I feel very clear on what change looks like on an interpersonal, small level. And I really believe in that. And I think probably I locate my sense of impact there. And then I also wonder about like larger senses of impact. Like sometimes I think these impacts on grants, they're asking about product focused, but I think they're also thinking about a different kind of impact and change, right? They're thinking about something that maybe happens on a policy level or something that happens in a, let's say, more mainstream. Again, I don't know what that term means, but in a way that people can click into that might make a larger, maybe larger, less, I don't know, larger change or smaller change. I don't quite know how to think about scale, I guess, in terms of impact. And I've been thinking, it's like I sort of wish I hadn't started talking because it's a bit of a jumble, but there's a couple of articles that I've been thinking deeply about. One of them is by John Grayson, and it's called Strategic Compromises. And it's looking at AIDS tapes, I think from the 80s, it might be from the 90s, 80s. Thank you. And I hope I don't do a terrible job of paraphrasing this article, but really thinking about the different compromises that filmmakers are making to do with very material realities, but also what kind of audience they're looking for and what kind of change they're looking for. And my reading of it, and I think I'm reading it through my perspective of thinking a lot about formal experimentation, is ending up looking at projects that are more formally experimental as often being more minoritized, like having less of a reach versus something that is maybe using more of the known formal tropes, like let's say a character arc or a conclusive ending that then are able to reach more people. And one of the things I love about that article is that my reading of it is John Grayson is not saying one is better than the other, saying that there's a kind of, especially thinking about at that time that all of those were needed, like many different levels were needed. And then basically saying like each artist is going to have to make their own strategic compromises based on what they're trying to do and where they locate their sense of change. And I don't totally know where to go with this thought. I just think about it a lot, and I don't quite understand why formal experimentation leads to a less, like it being slightly more like it reaching less people. I still don't totally understand what's at stake there, and why making other kinds of like compromises and things more seemingly accessible makes them reach wider. But I guess I'm just thinking, and maybe partly because we're at a more, I'm sorry, I keep using this word experimental, which is not a word that I like, but let's say less, I also don't like conventional. I don't know what word to use, but we're at a more, we're not at like a mainstream festival here. And so I'm so sorry to tell you that. But I guess I just like that question of like what our relationship is to change and to impact, I feel like is such an interesting political question to be having right now, especially maybe that's how I relate to some of this avant-garde question of like, what are we out to do? And how are each of us locating ourselves in this different diversity of tactics of where our work sits and how it impacts? And I guess, I don't know, I would just really love to know from everybody where you locate yourself on that and how you're thinking about it, because I think there's a chance for a really much more nuanced, complex understanding of how this stuff creates impacts from the very small to the bigger and how that relates to formal experimentation. So I'm sorry if that was definitely like you were in my brain for a while there, but that's something that I'm thinking about.
I mean, I really hope that's something we can all think and talk about over the next few days as we watch all of your films and the films of the folks who are sitting here with us and the folks who are not. There's a lot coming up. We have a screening at 1 p.m., the first one in the Bodecker for Mimesis 2024. So I hope to see you all there. And we'll end it here. Thank you so much, everyone.